My presentation is on the Warsaw Ghetto. Today we have a bit of a different definition of a ghetto than the kind I'm going to be talking about today. Today we think of ghettos as a small, rundown portion of a city, but the ghettos I'm going to be talking about are small, walled-off portions of cities that Nazis sent European Jews into as a place in between the injustice in their own homes and concentration camps or death camps. Warsaw was the largest of these ghettos, of the several ghettos in Germany. At its peak, it was home to over 400,000 people. The Warsaw Ghetto can be best explained through describing the conditions of living and dying in the ghetto, the life the children led, the culture that managed to survive, and the final uprising. If one had really wanted to constrict oneself to the official rations, then the entire population of the ghetto would have had to die of hunger in a very short time, says the Jewish Virtual Library. The average rations of a Jew in the ghettos was 200 calories a day, which is the equivalent of any one of these pictures you see here. Just one of those for an entire day. The conditions were less than stellar. They would shove 6 or 7 people all in one room to live, and the streets weren't much better because the area was so small and there were so many people in it. Because of this cramped space and the poor sanitary conditions, there was a typhoid epic. People were too weak to fight it off because they were starving, and the mortality rate by April of 1941 was 6,000 people per month. Children played a surprisingly important role in the events of the ghetto. Among the Jewish victims of the smuggling, there were tens of Jewish children between 5 and 6 years old shot in great numbers near the passages and at the walls, says the Jewish Virtual Library. These children just wanted to help their families find food because they were starving. Possibly their parents were sick or their siblings were sick, and they were punished for it. This is the wall that surrounded the ghetto that was built by the Jewish community of the ghetto because, of course, the Nazis did not want to build it themselves. It was 10 feet tall and topped with broken glass and barbed wire and was always patrolled by armed guards. But kids would still get through to smuggle, and if a German ever caught a child smuggling, they would be killed immediately, often shot. But it never stopped. The kids always kept trying. A woman named Nellie Susanna, who was shoved into the Warsaw Ghetto when she was just 4 years old, says, "I remember the fear of never feeling safe. You had to hide constantly." And she's alive today, of course, and spreads the word about the Holocaust as one of the survivors who never wants it to happen again. And as hopeless as the whole situation seemed, small amounts of Jewish culture still survived. There were theaters in the ghetto that staged plays and choruses and dancing and musical comedies, and there was a street that they called the Broadway of the ghetto called Lesno Street. The song you're hearing right now is called Ani Mamin, which is one of the songs listed, and it translates into I Believe. And I'm going to tell you the story of Marisia Eisenstadt, who was a soprano that sang a lot at the concerts of the ghetto. She had a nickname that was the Nightingale of the ghetto, and her ending was very much not a happy one. Her parents were being deported to Treblinka, and she panicked and ran after them and was shot and killed. Small groups of elementary school students met in soup kitchens and private homes. There were 2 secondary schools in which the language of instruction was Hebrew. The Jewish people understood that their children needed to be educated or their situations was never going to get better. Towards the very end, there was an uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. Nazis deported more than 300,000 Jews from the ghetto. Most of them were taken to the Treblinka death camp. In the fall of 1942, almost all the factions in the ghetto decided to resist future deportations, says PBS. This is the closest I could find to an accurate representation of how they would deport the Jews. in which they would basically just shove them all on onto the street, and then from there they would go into the trains that would take them away. Nazis announced that they would liquidate the ghetto on April 19, 1942, which means they would take everyone out and send them away. And so the Jewish people rallied anything they had ever smuggled that would become useful to resist. The Jewish had a few pistols, 17 rifles, some Molotov cocktails, and their fighters, they only had 750 who were all malnourished. And the Nazis, there were 2,000 of them, all healthy, all with military-grade guns. The fight went on until May 15th, almost a month, and then in the end, the Germans captured 56,000 Jews and the resistance lost. David Graber was a 19-year-old boy who spent his life in the ghetto with what he referred to as his treasure. His treasure was the archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, in which a group of people recorded everything they could. They got together pictures, they got together Nazi documents, they gathered any possible evidence of what had happened to them and what was happening to Jews all across Europe at this time. David was most likely killed in a concentration camp later, just a few years after this. There were many small caches of this archive found, and a lot of places are being searched still that give us the information you've just heard. But there is a rumor that the largest cache has yet to be found, though it's not for lack of searching for it, because there have been several places that have turned out to not have it. The Warsaw Ghetto can be best explained through describing the conditions of living and dying in the ghetto, the life the children led, the culture that managed to survive, and the final uprising. People like David risked their lives to archive this information so that it will never be forgotten. Will you let that effort be in vain, or will you help their cause?